Hello and welcome to Practical Inclusion. And as always, I'd like to start by acknowledging the Wadawurrung people on whose land that I get to live, work and play on. I was just reading a story of a woman, not a Wadawurrung woman, but a Tasmanian woman of Aboriginal ancestry, and it was a bit shady as to what country that she was originally from, but it talked about her full life story. And I've just spent the last 30 minutes reading this life story, and it was just so fascinating in so many ways, heartbreaking, and also so inspiring to read her story. So I'm going to try and find that story and post it in the chats for you to all read, because I thought it was really valuable. A call out to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are watching us today, either live or on the replay. And my guest today, I'll ask you, Polly, in a second if you can acknowledge the country, because I know you're not on the same country that I'm on today. As usual, I'm going to do my thing and pass over to my guest to get them to introduce themselves. Some people say that's lazy. I say this is about sharing stories. So the whole purpose of this platform is to be sharing stories and connecting that into how we create inclusion within workplaces, organisations, and the community more broadly. So Polly, with that, I'll throw it straight over to you. If you could introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself and why you find yourself on a practical inclusion show.
Thanks so much, Bree. And I am on Palawakana country here in Tasmania, the beautiful island of Lutruwita. So Yapalina, welcome and hello. And I'm incredibly grateful to be on this land, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners and the elders, past and present, and their incredible connection to land, sea, sky and story. And particularly in the line of work I do, the immense trauma of post-colonial world for our Aboriginal people. Thank you, Bree. I never think it's lazy to get someone to introduce themselves, because there's nothing that's more excruciating than watching someone read out some kind of a bio, and particularly with my bio, because it doesn't make any kind of linear sense. People kind of get into it and you can see their minds sort of going, I don't really understand how all this works. So I feel like it's a really sensible move. So
I feel the same way when it's happening to me.
Yeah, we have quite a similarity across our stories. So the reason I am on an excellent LinkedIn Live on Practical Inclusion is that I'm really at this very minute spending a lot of my time thinking about how do we create workplaces, create cultures, and create experiences for everyone that allow us to flourish. And so I'm going to work back from that point, because it's probably an easier place to sort of explain how I got here. So if I had to characterize how I've ended up in a professional sense, I'd say that much of the way I've been in my career has been entirely based on happenstance. I have a very interest-based nervous system, and I follow it like a curious puppy looking for interesting things to do. I've never really had a sense of knowing what I wanted to do. I've just known the things probably I didn't want to do. And I've been really always motivated to learn as I did. And particularly when I felt that learning was going to really stretch me or take me down some rabbit hole that I wanted to go down, I would just follow it around. And so the thematic through all of that has been, I tend to follow fast-moving ideas. I tend to follow people who have fast-moving ideas, which has kept me a lot in innovation and entrepreneurship, and in worlds where things are moving at clip. And then the more I spent time in those businesses as they went from an idea out into the entry into the marketplace, the more I became interested in who were the founders that made it, who were the personalities that actually got these great ideas to market, and noticed that it wasn't a particular pattern of this person got funding or this idea was really good. It really came down more to the capacity of the individual to be able to weather the vicissitudes of how stressful that kind of life is. And so the more I got into that, the more I got into leadership, and the more I got into leadership, the more I got into really trying to understand the human condition. And certainly since my earliest memories, I've been really fascinated by the search for meaning, what it is to be human, why we're here, a lot of those existential questions that most young children aren't asking. But I was always asking them. So the pursuit of people, the pursuit of the understanding of identity, and really, I guess, probably from an inside out way, I was looking for where I was going to feel like I was happy and flourishing and really engaged. And I was doing that by looking at other people. So the dual track of that is that it's now, as someone who runs their own consultancy and really works in a space of leadership and identity and psychotherapy and trauma a lot of the time and flourishing for others, I'm spending my time here mostly working with groups or organizations or individuals to be able to get them in a space where they can flourish. So that really is very kind of rambly. I went all over the place. I've worked in many, many different types of jobs. And probably the most intentional thing I've really done in my life is my academic work, which is my PhD and my honours thesis were in gender and identity, and my masters have been in creative writing and psychotherapy. So I've kind of clustered that all together very intentionally and with great joy. But I think the reason that they were really intentional, because they had nothing to do with my work. They were just things I wanted to pursue. I never thought I'd be an academic and teach in my field, which I haven't. And then the masters were very practical in terms of wanting to do specific things I needed a qualification for. So that's my rambly all around the world kind of way of getting here. And along with, as I was saying, my sort of crossover with some of Bree's interests is that I have a late ADHD diagnosis, which was actually this year, but I've recognized that that is a great explainer of how I am in the world from early childhood. And I also identify as non-binary, so I sit very much in that queer space and in that sort of trans-identifying allyship that comes with being a non-binary person wandering around in the world.
Thank you for that intro. That's paints such a nice picture, and I loved actually the way you framed it at the start as your interest-based nervous system, and then we saw how that followed, or what that followed as it went along the story.
That's a concept I stole directly from you, Bree, because it's really like I'd never heard anyone articulate what it was to actually just move from interest to interest rather than going, I need to follow a really good career progression here. It's just like, yes, I'll do that. And again, a lot of that stuff, I think in my early career was very much, you want me to do that? Yeah, sure. I'm just here to please you. And then it really became much more nuanced and into, no, I'm bored now. What's next? What's next? What's next? Where can I make a difference?
Yeah, I can really relate to that entirely. You talked about the goal being to create spaces where people can flourish. Before we kind of go into what that might look like, what does it mean to flourish? What does flourish mean in the way that you use it?
I like the idea of flourishing because there's sort of a natural, it feels like there's a nature-based element to it to me. So when we think about how do people be their best, there's a lot of expressions that I think very overused. You know, we're going to be our best selves, bring our whole selves to work, all that kind of stuff. But what we want is to recognize the chaos of the human organism, where it sits in the natural ecosystem, and that very much when we are flourishing, it means that we have access to all of the components within our ecosystems that allow us to fully thrive. And that's going to be environmental, it's going to be nutritional, it's going to be spiritual, it's going to be intellectual, it's going to be all of those things. But it also doesn't fix you at a point in time. So I'm not going to bring my best self to work every day because I'm going to be a continuum of experiences. Some days I'm going to bring in 100% extra poly. Other days I'm going to bring in maybe a 70% poly. And I work for myself, so I can really beat my own self up on that work. But I feel that for me, when I think about flourishing, I really think about a system approach to really understanding the complexity of humans and how to approach them in a one-size-fits-one. So they are at the most functional, regulated part of their nervous system as much as possible. They're safe enough to be themselves. And by being safe enough to be themselves in the part of their nervous system where they are really engaged with both sides of their brain, they will be able to innovate and create and feel connected and experience meaning and pleasure and emotion and all of the things that actually help us as humans to thrive.
So then what role does the workplace play in that? So that's, what you're describing is so holistic, and so many things need to come into play for somebody to be able to flourish. What parts of that are organizations in control of for their employees or have influence over?
Yeah, it's an interestingly phrased question, Bree, because I think that there is there is a relational aspect here for me that involves a fair amount of accountability on both sides, which I don't also think is often really the way we conceive what a workplace is. And there's lots of intersectional reasons why that also isn't the case. So I'm acknowledging that in some ways I'm talking about a utopia, but also I'm a realist in terms of the things that happen in workplaces. So I feel the workplace has a responsibility, or has an opportunity, to create as much of the environs, and that is the built environment. If it's a in real life, go into workplace, that is the culture, and being custodians of the culture in as much as the workplace culture is set by the organization, the people in it, the management, but also by the leadership in it, and by the people who work there as well. And they have that responsibility to understand when they enter a relationship with the individuals who work with them and for them, that they can ask what that individual needs, so the individual builds an ecosystem for themselves that is congruent with their flourishing. And there's lots of things that the organization can do. They can be constantly vigilant and aware of how they can make environments that are psychologically safe and or courageous, that they are able to make great accommodations for their individuals, that they can listen to the needs of their people and really do the thing that our brain and our nervous system is designed to do, which is to be in connection with another human and to be building a relational interchange of safety so we can flourish within that. And that's, there's simplicity and complexity there at the same time.
Yeah. Love this. If you are watching live, please, if you have questions for Polly, shoot them through on LinkedIn and I will ask them. All comments, thoughts, get the conversation going. And even if you're watching on the replay, do it, because we will absolutely get on our keyboards and respond.
We will.
So, okay, I'm interested then in that. I love the way you phrased it around the the relationship that you're actually engaging in when you employ someone. I think that makes a lot of common sense, but is also a different way of looking at recruitment than perhaps how we have done before. And you talked about asking them what they need, when and how.
And I want to just probably stay with the relational piece a bit longer, because I want to be really clear what I'm talking about. And I don't think we think about this enough. And often I think we come into a workplace and we feel we're in a transactional relationship because we are giving our time and our expertise and our skills for some financial benefit. And we're bringing something, the organization's bringing something, and we're seeing it we do see it in a resource-based way in many types of organizations. And I feel like this is it is a legacy way of thinking about what it is we are doing when we bring ourselves to work, wherever that is. And I think there's an industrial revolution sort of hangover of this, where we were working as, cogs of a whole, that we're producing things. In terms of the human being relational, when we're hardwired for connection and we know each other in a psychological sense, in connection to each other from the moment we're born, our attachment styles, the way our nervous systems actually build, happen in relation to other humans. They don't happen in isolation. And so if we saw the relationship with an employer or with an organization or with a culture as coming in at a point of equality, so you're not coming in, yes, you are going to have some sort of transaction. Yes, there is going to be an exchange of skills for money or for whatever it is. But the heart of the relational piece is I am trusting you to care for me. And in turn, I will care for you. And I'm going to care for this culture that we're building together. I'm going to care for how I interact with you. I'm going to make sure that is as kind and compassionate and boundaried and all of those things. That's really the relationship that isn't talked about enough. And so to move to your question, Bree, as to when and where, I believe in organizations where I see this done really well, it starts at the very first moment of interaction. It sits within the way someone is recruited. It sits within thinking about how every individual who would be suitable for the role might encounter that role. And it doesn't mean just one standard, generic, giant set of selection criteria that everyone has to fill in without any nuance as to, well, yes, maybe you can answer that, but are you the right fit? It starts with a lot of understanding of what the organizational values are and what my authenticity and values are, and how's that going to meld together. What is my personality going to be in this organization? Can I be a disruptor, or can I be someone who's very much enmeshed in a team? Like, I want all that understanding to be there. And so for me, it's a lot of work up front in the recruitment part. It's an equal amount of commitment to onboarding and to really making sure that someone comes in and is held in relation in the organization and is brought into belonging with other people in that organization, which is what humans need to flourish and to feel safe. And then that is all the way through. It's a very active feedback culture. It's an active culture where there isn't a sense of very hierarchical power. There's a much more sort of unilateral capacity to move information up and down and across lines. And that way people really feel seen. They really feel valued. They feel autonomy, and they can make choices within the culture as to where they want to go. And I think really contribute to that. That's my fantasy world.
Yeah, look, what I want to ask now is, in that space, how do I phrase this? When an organization says, we're going to focus on neurodiversity now, for example, and their first action is, well, let's find somebody who can run some awareness training. Value, yes, but that awareness training, that one-off half-hour lunch and learn that they run once, is not going to affect what you're describing in terms of how those interactions occur for a person who perhaps is neurodivergent who comes into that workplace. What have you seen that actually allows that environment to occur that you were just describing, particularly for people who are neurodivergent?
So it's actually a focus, a commitment, and an investment in time and an investment in resources in a whole of life of entry into being in and exit from an organization. And I think one of the problems that we often see is that there is an idea that if you bring in someone to do some training, or even if, again, in the world I work in, if you bring in someone to do a leadership course, the action of bringing the person in is undertaking what it is you want to achieve, as against the reality that most of the time it's the very beginning of the start of awareness. And so you might go to a half-hour thing on neurodiversity or being neurodivergent. And if you're neurotypical, you might be, I had no idea that was what's going on. That makes so much sense why Polly's brain's like that. Or if you're a neurodivergent, you might also be going, oh my God, this is me. This is my experience. And now I have to actually think about my whole life if I haven't really gone down that road before. Or you might be there going, yes, now what are you going to do about it? So I think it's really around, when the discussion begins, it needs to be ongoing, and it needs to hold the tension lightly around that not all neurodivergent people need to be running all of the neurodivergent things. The accommodations aren't relying on someone who is already potentially in a marginality, and this goes for anyone, to have to do that heavy lifting. The onus is on the people running the organization to go, okay, so we might think that conservatively 20% of our staff might have some of the neurodivergent features. But actually, what we know to be true is that good accommodations for neurodivergent people are great accommodations for everyone. And it's not like, oh, we're setting up this bubble over here for people to be in. It's just like we're making environments that are actually gentler on the brain, are more flexible, are more tailored to an individual's needs. And so generally, those accommodations work all the way through. But like with the leadership example, doing a leadership course is the beginning of then being able to go back into the organization, to put those actions in place, to fail a few times, to have mentors and people in the organization to have discussions with and have experiences of feedback on what you're doing, and growing those skills all the way along. So in terms of how would we have a sort of neurodivergent friendly workplace, we're at this, I think, an unfortunate tension in lots of ways, where we're still wanting to name up and other groups of people because they're not in a homogenous mass. But really what we should be doing is saying we need to make places which help all people flourish. Now, right now, it's important for trans people, for neurodiverse people, for people with different abilities, for a whole lot of people to have an acknowledgement that their experience of the world is not the same as other people's, and that isn't necessarily good or bad. It's just the reality of where we are. I hope for a time where we don't have to label people and other them and or marginalize to be able to make their lives as flourishing as everyone else.
Yeah. Thumbs up to that. I think I was just having this conversation last week about how problematic that can be when we still look at particularly diversity, equity, and inclusion work in that siloed approach of let's do gender, let's do disability. Oh, we're going to have a neurodiversity group because that's a thing now. It's like, hang on.
Yes.
Are we just going to keep tacking these things on, or are we actually going to look at, well, how do we make that process, if we're thinking about recruitment, or how do we make that more inclusive and safe for everybody? Recognizing but not losing the nuances that are required to make that happen.
But I think there's also this feeling that like, oh, the neurodiversity bucket isn't stealing from the neurotypical bucket. You know, the women bucket isn't stealing from the men bucket. It's like we haven't got some really basic stuff in the workplace right yet. So the sort of moving on at clip to, oh, we're going to do gender now, and now we're going to do neurodiversity, and it'll be this thing. It's like, actually, we have to look at it as a whole, which also means when we talk about the relational world, we have to acknowledge, without it being punishing, that there are some people who have a better and a more equitable access to the spaces in which they can flourish than others. And what we want is for those people to go, yeah, I'm going to use this to make sure that we all come to this place together. And it can't be pushed and it can't be driven solely by the people who are already possibly having to push harder, to work harder, to deal with more, to just show up in the spaces that they work. So again, it's not about how does each group get this. It's about how do we all recognize that if we want to be in great cultures, we need to be connected. And if we're connected, we're working very much as a team, loving and respecting and moving through each person's strengths, which is why for me the natural environment and the ecosystem systems approach really speaks to different phases of need, daily, weekly, yearly, momentarily, and the capacity for those systems to self-support, because there's a recognition that where the need is, the resource goes at the time it's needed.
Yeah, cool. So if you're talking to, which I know you're doing all the time, talking to leaders, where do you tell, without making you give away your IP, where do you tell them to start in terms of creating a culture that is relational and will create that inclusion for everyone?
Yeah, and look, I have no problem giving away my IP because I'm not egotistical enough to think I've ever had an original thought that isn't just an absorption of all of the people in the world who are doing this work. So I think that, again, for me, that holding on keeps me separate. And so really, firstly, it's about, it depends where people are in their own evolution. What really changed my game personally was to recognize that the world wasn't being done to me, that I was doing the world to myself. And I really needed to do the work that sat alongside how was I going to evolve in my own world, which is things as fun as doing a lot of therapy and doing a lot of professional development and self-development and reflection and all of the somatic work and all of the things that allowed me to come into a much more grounded place in who I was in the world, which then allowed me to engage with others from a place where I was not performing leadership or performing leadership trainer, but I was just being me, which is an incredibly powerful thing to show someone what it looks like to show up as yourself. In and of itself, that is it's a courageous act of leadership. So depending on where people are, sometimes the first step is, as we were sort of just alluding to make an awareness that everything isn't as it is in your world. Sometimes that's quite a big penny to drop for people. For others, it's about the sort of practical way of I'm not quite sure how to have the conversations that need to be had, and I'm nervous about having them. So a lot of the work I do in leadership is helping people to be able to stay regulated when they're having conversations they feel uncomfortable about. And that might not necessarily be a difficult conversation or a conflict-driven conversation. It might just be that someone wants to ask me about accommodations for non-binary people, or ask me about how to talk about something, and they don't want to offend me, or they don't feel they are equipped to have the conversation. And so it's helping people to understand the courage, vulnerability, and capacity to fail that's needed in any kind of conversation. So you can respectfully go into workplaces and as a leader initiate those conversations from a place of openness and humility and vulnerability. And really it is at the whole way along engaging everyone in the conversation as well. And I said before, it's not the job of marginalized people to educate. There is also a place for being able to have really true co-design and consultation that is then understood, reflected, and adopted and adapted by management and by leadership. And I really feel like that's the way. It's a continual process, and you're picking up lots of different experiences and timings along the way, which you have to be aware of. But it never happens I don't think it ever happens really quickly. And I heard someone at a leadership conference the other day say, nothing that's good ever happens fast in nature. And I really thought about that because, again, I spend so much time thinking about humans as mammals and our nervous systems and how our behavior relates to our experiences of safety and how we've grown up and all of the things that make us who we are. And if you really think about it, the only things that happen really swiftly in nature usually involve safety or predation and sometimes have a relatively catastrophic ending. So everything else has a cadence to it, and we need to look to those natural cadences more than kind of, okay, we're going to make this sweeping change and everyone's on board. It's like, that's not how we do it.
I love that. So focus on self-understanding how you're showing up and why, so that you can be in a better space to be able to recognize when perhaps, as you said, people don't have the same experience that you have had perhaps. And then getting comfortable with those conversations. And that it takes time. I think that's a great kind of summary and way to end the conversation today. Thank you so much for giving me some of your time and the audience some of your time. I've just learned so much even from our last conversation where you were asking me questions, and now I've learned so much more from what you've shared today. So thank you so much for doing that. Thanks to everybody for listening in. As I said, get those questions, comments, and we will get back to you. Just a quick plug. I've loaded up. Last year I did a trans and gender diverse inclusion in the workplace webinar that, considering what's happening in the world right now, seems good timing to be showing that around. You can jump onto my profile and watch that and perhaps pick up some tips that you can implement in your workplace straight away, and some longer term tips as well. You can find Polly on LinkedIn, but Polly, is there any other places that you'd like people to go to catch up on your content? And
I'd love you to head to Spotify to my podcast, Polly's Vague Theories. We've got a great new season that's out called All Brains Welcome, where we're looking at diversity and inclusion, particularly for neurodiverse folk. There's a fantastic episode with Bree on it, which is live now, and I've just launched episode 4 today. So that's a really nice place to start if you want to go a bit deeper into all the places my brain's going at the moment.
Yeah, would highly recommend that. So jump on there. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll be back again. As always, send through ideas for topics, guests. Be brave and ask to come on yourself. It would be great to have a chat with you. Catch you all next time.
Thank you. Bye.